So I know this is coming a little bit late, but it's officially been over a year since I uploaded my first video to this channel, and the growth has been tremendous. I greatly appreciate all of you. I know I haven't been at it for that long, but I'd like to think I've come a long way from not knowing how to put videos in the right aspect ratio and recording audio on my phone using Apple earbuds. It's been a great year, and I hope I can keep doing this for more years to come. In order to celebrate such a milestone, I figured it'd be fun to make a video about different years and what my favorite albums are to come from each of them. Also, I saw that dude Alpha Media make a video about his favorite albums from every year he's been alive, and I thought, yeah, that might make a fun video topic. Before I start the list though, I want to say that what my favorites are from a given year could easily change at some point in the future. I mean, hell, some of my picks are already different from albums that I had as my highest on my 2010s list that I put up earlier this year. In other words, don't take anything I say seriously. With that out of the way, here are my favorite albums from every year that I have been on this earth. 2001 was a pretty loaded year for albums. It was the height of the disparity between mainstream and underground hip-hop, with the bling era being at the height of its popularity, and underground labels like Def Jux starting to put out some of the most left-field and genre-defining indie rap of the 2000s. Everything from the somewhat offbeat and spoken word flows to the futuristic and otherworldly production makes this music feel like a complete reconstruction of East Coast hip-hop. It's amazing that it's able to remain so topical, relevant, and hard-hitting while sounding completely different from anything else that's been done before. In fact, you can probably just take one look at my channel name, banner, and intro music and guess that my favorite album of 2001 is The Glow Part 2. This is one of the most brilliant concept albums ever made, with the title referencing the glow motif that was on the Microphone's previous album, It Was Hot We Stayed in the Water, meaning the wonderful things that you see in a person after you fall in love. At the end of that album though, the relationship comes to an end because both of them burn to death, except for Phil, and The Glow Part 2 is essentially him trying to live on after the glow has blown away. Even if you were to completely ignore the concept of this album and how it connects to surrounding Microphone's records, the music on here is absolutely stunning. It has the intimacy and homemade quality of a great lo-fi indie folk record, yet is somehow able to pull off a gargantuan and epic sound without sacrificing the humanity behind it. The album's pretty unpredictable as well, combining melodic earworms, droning interludes, and noisy experiments into an hour-long epic that never ceases to amaze me. As much as I do obviously love The Cold Vein, The Glow Part 2 is my second favorite album of all time, and one that I feel like I could talk about for hours on end, which maybe I'll do at some point, who knows. God Loves Ugly is a prime example of an album that I do acknowledge is pretty flawed, yet that doesn't get in the way of my enjoyment of the record. Despite some of the tacky hooks, fairly standard beats, and occasional battle rap bars that just don't land at all, to me this album does so much more right than it does wrong. This LP is often cited as one of the first examples of emo rap, as many of the bars and song topics deal with personal and emotional issues like failing relationships, alcoholism, and poor family dynamics. In fact, Slug was actually the first to coin the term emo rap all the way back in 1997 in an Herb magazine article. Now obviously this album doesn't sound like how we know emo rap to sound now, but hearing these beautifully sad and poetic bars over these boom bap inspired beats is something that I don't think any other album has quite been able to replicate since. After all, the beats on this album are still very memorable, well produced, and perfectly capture the mood of every track. I mean, I wouldn't use Song About a Friend as background music in nearly all of my videos if I didn't think it was great. The real thing that makes this an all-time favorite of mine though are the lyrics and just how clever and poignant they are throughout the vast majority of the runtime. Songs like Saves the Day, Vampires, and especially the title track have some of the most quotable lines that I've heard in any rap song and continue to resonate with me every time I hear them.
Appears more clear in its simplest form. Nobody sees tears when you're standing in the storm. I do believe in monsters. I call them officers. You should get a tattoo that says warning. That's all, just a warning.
I understand if Atmosphere comes across as a little bit corny for some people, but this is easily among my favorite albums to come out of the 2000s. For my 2003 pick, I have a relatively overlooked album that I rarely hear get discussed when talking about music from this year. Formed in 2002 in Cape Town, South Africa, a group of MCs and DJs called the Constructus Corporation released their first and only album, The Ziggurat, inside of a 54-page book that goes along with the narrative of the album. In fact, many of the passages are directly stated within the record itself. It follows protagonists Random Boy and Kid Tronic living on a giant floating island called the Ziggurat, built by the Constructus Constructus Corporation as they strive to become the greatest rappers in the world and uncover the secrets of the mysterious company that runs this place they live in. It's got some musical sci-fi ideas that remind me a bit of Ziggy Stardust, and is riddled with social commentary about over-policing and the government having too much power. While the story is pretty creative and I like the way it's told, the real thing that sticks out about this record for me is just how differently it approaches hip-hop. The beats on here are very glitchy and synthetic, yet manage to maintain a level of smoothness and cohesiveness that you don't usually get with glitch hop. There's also the rap flows on here that, more often than not, are straight up spoken as if this album is half audiobook. While getting through the entire thing may take a couple of days, as this is a double disc album with nearly 3 hours of material on it, it's a record that I've thought about quite a bit after listening, and I can't help but applaud producers Cybot, Felix Labonde, and Marcus Wormstorm, as well as MCs Joaquin Tudor Jones and Yolandi Weiser for making such a unique and creative piece of... Wait a minute, Joaquin Tudor Jones and Yolandi Weiser? Where have I heard those names before? Let me Google this real quick.
Nowadays all these rappers sound exactly the same as like one big inbred fest.
What? Yep, believe it or not, the two fronting members of the infamous D-Antwoord were actually in this very thought-provoking, forward-thinking, and artful group that made some of the most compelling music of the 2000s. I really don't know what happened in between the release of this album and this one, but something tells me I don't want to know. Anyway, I'd highly recommend this thing if you're into wordy and strangely produced hip-hop. 2004 was a pretty decent year for music. We got Kanye's debut, Arcade Fire's debut, Regina Spektor's Soviet Kiss, which is pretty excellent aside from that one song, and there's a couple compilations that came out this year that I love, like DNA on DNA, which is the closest thing to a full-length album that we're ever gonna get from the legendary no-wave band DNA, as well as John Fay's The Great Santa Barbara Oil Slick, which is among my favorite live albums of all time. With all the great records that came out this year, which one could possibly take the #1 spot? It's Madvillainy. Yeah, I know it's not the most unexpected choice, but all of the acclaim that this album has gotten over the past decade and a half is well warranted. Both Doom and Madlib were at the absolute peaks of their career when they began recording this in the early 2000s, and are in top form for the entirety of this record. The tracks go by very quickly, with little in the way of hooks or conventional song structuring, allowing it to quickly move on from one idea to the next. That being said though, none of these songs feel half-baked or like they needed to be longer, as the dense sample flips and even denser bars are enough to make each track satisfying on their own. This album also plays into the conceptual elements of both Doom and Madlib's music, with tracks like Fancy Clown, which is rapped from the perspective of Victor Vaughn after Doom stole his girl, and Shadows of Tomorrow, which delves deeper into the psychedelic headiness of Madlib's Quasimodo persona. There's just so many iconic moments all over this thing, like the vivid descriptions of a schizophrenic prostitute on Meat Grinder, the relentless rhyming on Figaro, and probably the nerdiest weed anthem in all of hip-hop, America's Most Blunted. It's truly a genre-defining album for the 2000s underground, and there's really nothing I can even say about it that hasn't been said a million times before. 2005 was really one of the best years for music that the 2000s had to offer. It had plenty of great releases that could now be argued as modern classics in indie folk, post-hardcore, pop, hip-hop, etc. While a few of my all-time favorites are from this year, my #1 has to go to the heartbreaking folk record, The Complete Guide to Insufficiency by David Thomas Broughton. I'd love to give this thing an essentials video at some point, but for now I'll say that this is an expansive journey through the darkest corners of the human psyche, explored through music that takes the established norms of the singer-songwriter formula and presents them in a whole new light. The melancholy and subtly contrasting layers of acoustic guitar are reminiscent of Nick Drake, while the long and repetitive song structuring is more akin to John Fahey. What really brings it all home, though, are David's deep and haunting vocals and the way he chooses to weave them into these songs. The 5 tracks that make up this album are all similarly structured, starting off with around a minute or two of instrumentation to help establish the key, tempo, and overall mood of the song, before turning into an acoustic ballad with extended metaphors and earwormy melodies to keep you sucked in. Once the balladry has come to an end, the song continues to linger on, taking some of the very same vocal passages and guitar riffs that you just listened to, and layering them on top of each other into a hypnotic and repetitive musical refrain, effectively allowing the gut-wrenching emotions of the track to stay prevalent for minutes on end. It's almost as if David's illustrating that confronting your emotional issues won't necessarily make them go away, and how depression can truly feel inescapable, which I think is only emphasized by the fact that each track bleeds into one another totally seamlessly. In other words, this is a fun summer album that you can play in the convertible with your friends and jam out to when you're cruising down the highway. So I know a lot of people like to compare Introducing, Since I Left You, and Donuts because they're three of the most popular sample-based albums to come out within a 10-year span of each other, but to me Donuts stands so high above both of these albums that it's not even close. In fact, despite all the acclaim that this album usually gets, I feel like people overlook how chillingly genius it actually is. Using little more than a small SP303 sampling device and a record player that could only play 45s, Dilla was able to tell his entire life story and prove that he was the first true virtuoso of his kind. The 31 tracks that are on this album feel representative of each year in Dilla's life, capturing all of the different emotions that encompass the human experience. I love the way the record comes full circle as well, with the intro track essentially being the album's outro, which plays after the final song, Welcome to the Show. It not only gives the album's title more meaning, on top of being a reference to the 45s that were sampled to make the record, but illustrates just how passionate Dilla was about music throughout his entire lifetime. After all, the vast majority of this album was made while he was literally on his deathbed in the hospital suffering from a rare blood disease, and if that's not passion, I don't know what is. While Dilla's abrupt passing is probably one of the biggest losses we've ever had in the history of modern music, at least he was able to see his magnum opus get released to the world, if only for a couple of days. Even if you were to completely ignore all of that context though, Donuts would still be an incredible celebration of music that transcends just being a collection of rap beats. The way that Dilla is able to completely breathe new life into every sample that he touched is something that to this day very few others can replicate. It's undeniably a modern classic, and one that's legacy is well deserved. Two of my absolute favorite albums of all time came out this year, one of which being of Montreal's Hissing Fauna Are You the Destroyer, which is my favorite pop album, and the other is AJJ's People Who Can Eat People Are the Luckiest People in the World. If I had to pick between the two, I'd say AJJ wins by just a hair, but if this came out in almost any other year, then it would undoubtedly have the #1 spot. Folk punk is easily one of my favorite genres, period. Something about the raw and angsty energy of punk music being stripped down into acoustic instrumentation and folkier songwriting elements allows for uniquely personal and unflinchingly honest expression that few other genres can quite capture in the same way. One of the most popular and definitive acts in this style is a Phoenix band called Andrew Jackson Jihad, or AJJ for short. A band that I would argue has one of the most essential and overlooked discographies in modern rock, from the hilarious and absurd folk tunes on their debut, to the electric yet equally clever indie rock of albums like Knife Man and The Bible too. Their most acclaimed and widely recognizable album though is People Who Can Eat People Are the Luckiest People in the World, and for good reason. I mean, who wouldn't want to listen to this after hearing that title? Of all of the albums that I've heard across all genres, I can't really think of another one that quite captures the panicky feeling of a nervous breakdown as vividly as this one. The frantic guitar strumming, wailing vocals, and dark yet somewhat stream of consciousness lyrics make the music on here kind of hard to swallow on first listen. That being said though, it manages to maintain a small semblance of optimism with tracks like No More Tears, and especially the closer, and is absolutely loaded with a dark sense of humor. You could argue that the chord progressions and overall approach to playing is kind of predictable in hindsight, but I personally find folk punk to be more appealing for its personality, lyrical content, and energy than strictly the instrumentation. It's for this reason that if I ever made music personally, then this is probably the album that I would draw the most inspiration from, as it's emotionally provocative as all hell, yet is still funny and has its own unique sense of charm. It's also only 25 minutes long, and there's not a single moment where the album loses steam or even feels all that repetitive. Part of me really wanted to put Madlib's Beat Conductive Volume 5 in this spot because it's such a heartfelt goodbye to his close friend and frequent collaborator Jay Dilla, told entirely through sampled loops that are as brilliantly pieced together as some of his best work. But the album from this year that I find myself returning to the most is Hello Everyone, Nice to Meet You, We Are Midori by, well, Midori. This is another album that I'd love to give an Essentials video to at some point, because it has some of the most unlikely genre fusions of its time. In fact, I find it kind of difficult to even categorize this record at all. At its core, I guess you could say it's a hardcore punk album with elements of jazz, twee pop, and piano rock, yet I feel like even that description is not enough to prepare you for what's in store. The band's leading vocalist, Mariko Goto, has this incredible ability to sing these sweet and cutesy melodies that'll get stuck in your head, and then immediately bust bust out an ear-shattering scream that almost sounds more reminiscent of black metal than it does post-hardcore. This mends surprisingly well with the instrumentation that sounds like a classically trained jazz band playing in the context of hardcore punk. The way the group chooses to emphasize the upright bass and piano just as much, if not more so, than the electric guitar, gives it this open and somewhat improvisational feeling that I don't think has quite been matched by any other album of its kind. Despite carving out this very distinct sound for themselves, the record is able to remain unpredictable, with some tracks that aim to be as abrasive and kick-ass as possible, while others are more simple and endearing. It's addictive, creative, one-of-a-kind, and absolutely packed from start to finish, with one stellar track after another. I guarantee you'll be revisiting this thing for years to come if you decide to check it out, assuming this kind of stuff is your cup of tea to begin with. So my favorite album of 2009 would probably have to be Masked Dancers by the brave little Abacus, but spoiler alert for 2 minutes later in this video, I don't want to put the same band on here twice in a row, especially when I've already talked about them at pretty great length in their own video, so I'm gonna go with Daughter of Darkness by Natural Snow Buildings. Although I've already talked about this album too, damn it! Well, maybe the reason I keep talking about it is just because it's so awesome, and also it's longer than many bands' entire discographies, so I think it's justifiable to bring it up multiple times. The atmosphere that this album creates out of various stringed instruments, percussion, and tribal chanting is enough to make it stick out from nearly every other drone or ambient album, period. While the song progressions and compositions do generally move very slowly, there's an improvisational element to the various instrumental layers that keep these tracks interesting throughout their enormous runtimes. It's like witnessing a super long guitar solo at a heavy metal concert, only instead of a heavy metal concert, it's a cult, and instead of a guitar solo, it's initiation. If that sounds appealing to you, or you just really love music that offers a dense atmosphere to zone out and get lost into for hours on end, then this is probably the album for you. 2010 is easily one of, if not the strongest year for music in the 2010s for me. Vaporwave was being pioneered by the likes of Oneohtrix Point Never, trap was starting to sound more like the genre we know it as today, and we had some of the best releases of the decade in numerous genres from pop and electronic to metal and singer-songwriter. Some of my all-time favorites are from this year as well, like MIA's Maya, which predates a lot of the norms that we see today in industrial hip-hop and PC music, as well as this album that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. There's genuinely about 6 or 7 records that I think would be worthy of the #1 spot had they come out in a weaker year, but if you guys know me, then you know my #1 has to be Just Got Back from the Discomfort. Despite how much of a lo-fi, cacophonous mess this album might sound on first listen, there's beautiful musicianship behind every single one of these tracks. I heard someone describe this album as sounding like it was written over the span of multiple years and then was quickly recorded in a day, and I think that's a pretty accurate way of describing it. The musical ambition behind many of these songs can go toe-to-toe with some big progressive rock bands, yet it still has the homemade quality of something you'd randomly find on Bandcamp. I really don't think there's anything else I can even say about this record that I haven't said already, but there's a reason why I hold the Brave Little Abacus as my favorite band and still continue to this day. Since this video is getting kind of long and we're only halfway through, I'm gonna split this into 2 halves and talk about the rest in my next video, which hopefully won't take too long to finish. Let me know what your favorite albums are from every year you've been alive and why you feel the way you do about them. As always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, you know the drill.